Good morning, friends. Thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to be with you. Before I jump in, I'd like to just share a brief humorous story. I watched a live performance of an excellent one-man show, piece of theater, from Florence, Italy on Sunday. And the artist, Hershey Felder, he's a famous actor who does this, that he puts on one-man shows based on the lives of famous composers. And so he personifies the composer throughout his life and plays a lot of his music. And this performance was on Irving Berlin, an American songwriter who I knew very little about, but of course his music is so integrated into American culture that even I recognized many of his tunes. But the one that stuck with me the best and made me laugh the most was one of his earliest tunes, and it was a great example of attunement to mass consciousness and being able to epitomize something that everybody was experiencing. This was in like the 1920s, I think, and he wrote a song called "My Wife's Gone to the Country, Hooray!" And the chorus goes something, I don't remember the melody, but the words of the chorus was, "My wife's gone to the country, hooray, hooray!" And it's the song of a husband who's now, a free man for the weekend and is celebrating. And the part that particularly got me was like 3 verses in, the song describes about how the man gets a parrot who always repeats what he says, and then the last chorus is the parrot singing, "My wife's gone to the country, hooray!" It was quite funny. But the reason I bring this up is because that was a perfect example of someone taking mass consciousness and with just a little bit of love and a good sense of humor, turning it into something very enjoyable. That was incredibly popular at the time. But what Yogananda is doing with these Whispers from Eternity is something completely different. That we have to consciously raise our level of consciousness to receive these. Because unlike a parrot singing "My wife's gone to the country, hooray," these aren't necessarily like inherently funny or charming. We have to raise our level of consciousness to appreciate them for what they are. Otherwise, they can feel a little bit distant or, like unreachable to our everyday state of consciousness. But that was sort of the purpose of these prayers, I think. These are like Master's consciousness reaching out to us, offering us a way to touch into his depth a little more easily. That these are like lifelines into deeper consciousness if we're able to really absorb them, attune our hearts to their vibration, and allow ourselves to be transformed by them. So let's take a look at this week's talk, or this week's topic, I should say, which is Whispers from Eternity number 66, "Burn Thou My Frailties in the Furnace of Trials." So let's begin. I'll just read it together, and let's feel that this is in fact a deep yearning of our own hearts. So let's close the eyes, center our awareness in the heart. In the furnace of trials, the ore of my life is being purified. The fire of experience melts away all my delusions' dross. O divine artisan, burn away all my impurities. Bring out in me the steel of endurance and hone it to a fine edge by deep calmness. Forge in me from the tempered steel of mental balance sharp swords of self-control and firm tenacity. With the weapon of inner equilibrium, teach me to fight every enemy of distraction. Isn't that beautiful? Like I mentioned, I think just a few weeks ago, this is the second reference that I'm aware of, there's probably many more, where Yogananda talks about swords being related to calmness, which I think is very interesting. So, or he sort of equates them together in his analogies. And so perhaps there's something deeper there that we ought to meditate on. But one thing that caught my attention in this prayer is, of course, the the overt analogy of being forged into a sword, because there's a lot of beautiful symbolism that goes on throughout this prayer, but also in the literal process that used to have to happen to make a sword. And as nerdy as this may sound, I'm actually going to share a little bit of the process that one would undergo to make, as Yogananda puts it, a fine steel of inner awareness, because that outer process is an analogy for our inner process. The first thing that really is striking, of course, is the first line of this prayer. He says, "In the furnace of trials, the ore of my life is being purified." And the first process of making steel is to extract the metal out of ore. And so too in our life, if we want to become pure, if we want to become strong in ourselves, we need to extract the purity of God's consciousness in our heart out of all of our life's experiences. And the only way to do that is by adding the fire of the furnace of life's trials. Because otherwise, we wouldn't really have any incentive to grow stronger or to grow firmer in ourselves or to grow or to learn. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because what this prayer really gave to me when I took this Whispers for a month or 6 weeks or something was gratitude for my life's trials. And that's why I chose that chant we started with, "Through all trials we'll sing thy name. Joy in thee is life's sole aim." Because we may think that trials are really, uncomfortable or unfair or a nuisance, but in fact, even trials themselves are a gift from God, designed to help purify us, designed to help bring us to a greater level of joy and an unfoldment of our own soul potential. And without them, we would be stuck forever in our current state of consciousness. And like I mentioned a few weeks ago, just ask yourself, do you really think the current state of consciousness that you have is it? Is the zenith of human potential? I pray not. I desperately pray not. And so if it's through the furnace of trials that we have to go to explore our deeper potential, then through all trials we'll sing thy name. Because I want deeper awareness of God's presence. I want deeper wisdom. I want deeper love. And so if that's the route to get it, so be it. The fire of experience melts away all my delusions' dross. Now this is beautiful, because what this brings to mind for me is that only the fire of experience can melt away certain delusions. That we just have to experience things. We might even intellectually understand a concept or have heard it lectured in a class many times, but sometimes we just have to go through the fire of our own experience to understand it in a deeper way. And so when you find yourself going through the fire of some outward purification in your experience, instead of turning your face away from it, try asking, what is God purifying in me? What is He trying to reveal to me through this process? And you may discover then that those trials become actually deep blessings, because they're revealing to you who you are on a deeper level. O divine artisan, burn away all my impurities. Bring out in me the steel of endurance and hone it to a fine edge by deep calmness. Now I'm going to transgress a little bit here, if that's the right word, and tell a little bit of a side story, because I find this sort of thing fascinating. But apparently archaeologists have found some relics from the 5th, 6th, and like all the way up to the 9th or 10th centuries, that they have found old swords that were forged and created very early on in those dark ages. And mind you, this is at like the very depths of Kali Yuga, if we're talking the 5th century, like the nadir of our cyclical pattern of human consciousness. And what's interesting is at that time, the science of steel, of making steel, of metallurgy, was largely lost. And fascinatingly enough, it was retained by only a very few people who largely resided in monasteries in Europe. And there was a particular smith, or a master smith, who resided in a Frankish monastery, who signed all of his work with his name, or perhaps it was the name of his monastery, nobody knows, but it's called Ulfbert. And so there have been discovered a number of swords taken from archaeological dig sites with his name printed on it. And the reason this is incredible is because they have been able to analyze the steel composition of these blades. And the first most notable thing about these swords is that they actually survived. Think about being buried for 1,500 years, and then it's still intact by the time they dig it up. Most every other piece of metallurgy from that era has been completely dissolved because it was of such an unrefined quality that the earth just eats it. But these swords are some of the most well-preserved of that era. And they were made with exquisite craftsmanship and with a degree of understanding, metallurgical understanding, that was completely above every other steel or every other blacksmith at that time. And so I thought this was fascinating that that information, that knowledge was saved in monasteries primarily. But what's fascinating is those swords, those Ulfbert swords, it would take weeks or months to craft a single one of those swords because the process was so in-depth. They had to smelt the iron out of ore. Then they had to impregnate that iron with carbon by slowly cooking it in the embers of charcoal underground for weeks at a time. And then once they had the different variations of iron and pig iron and cast iron, then they would melt all of that in a crucible, if that was possible, and then they would be left with a refined piece of steel, but then still they would spend weeks, a master smith would spend weeks forging out from a lump of processed steel a blade. And they would fold that steel thousands of times, and with every blow of their hammer, they would be reworking even like the molecular structure of that steel. And ideally, what was incredible about these swords, and believe me, this has a spiritual allegory, which will come to light in a moment, was these master smiths who, sheltered away in monasteries, would spend hours working on these blades. I mean, weeks and weeks with a master smith and his apprentices. And they would get these steel, they would work this steel into such masterwork material that the edges of these swords would be razor sharp, would have a really high concentration of carbon so that it would hold its edge and be unmovable, unbreakable. But then the heart of the sword, the spine of the sword, they called it, was of a softer steel. And that was imperative because a sword actually needs to be able to bend and to be able to not snap when it's met with resistance, but the edge needs to be incredibly hard to be able to hold a fighting edge. And so these swords were truly so far beyond the rest of the smithing technology at their time that they were actually almost considered to be magical. And they were so valuable that a king or a local warlord might spend a fortune to acquire one of these Ulfbert swords because their edges were so keen, their metal was so pure, and their spines were so flexible that literally other weapons would just be destroyed by them. There have been many accounts of swords like this when meeting contact with a poorly made weapon, the poorly made weapon would just snap. But these Ulfbert swords would never break because their spines were malleable and their edges were honed to a perfect edge. And so these weapons became incredibly valuable to warlords, and like I said, were even almost considered to be magical, like think of the myth of Excalibur. And at the time, they didn't know what was creating such a fine product, but it was just a metallurgical science that was beyond most of the other smiths at the time. But for us, that's exactly the process that our soul is going through, our heart is going through our trials. And we have to be purified because we have to overcome all of the darkness, all of the delusion that we have entertained over millions of years. And so that sword of our inner spine, of our heart, of our love for God, needs to be like that perfectly crafted instrument that is completely free of impurities. Because wherever there is impurity in steel is weakness. That's where the steel can break. And so in a poorly made weapon, where the entire length is impure, if it's struck too hard or at the wrong angle at any point along its blade, it'll snap, it'll shatter. But a perfectly made weapon will bend and will be malleable and will hold its integrity no matter what happens. I've actually seen videos of well-crafted swords literally being put in a vise and being bent in half. And then as soon as they release the tension, it springs back to exactly where it was before. And this is what we need to be. We need to be totally malleable. We need to be able to be flexible with the circumstances of life, to be unbroken by our trials. And then as soon as that tension is relieved from our spines, we need to be able to spring back and be battle ready in our consciousness, so to speak. Not to fight the world outwardly, but to fight that inner battle of our consciousness. And so, if you, like me, enjoy reading up on a little bit of history, you might enjoy seeing there's some fun YouTube documentaries on these weapons and the process that is undergone to make them. But that's what really we're all going through. Like the divine artisan, as Yogananda puts it, is crafting out of our spines a masterwork piece of steel that can conquer all foes and will never break. And if you think about yourself in this analogy, the steel has to undergo those processes to become great, to become unbreakable, to become a hero. And without those steps, without being thrown into the furnace of trials, without being heated to literally a red-hot heat or a white-hot heat, it cannot be shaped. It cannot be worked into a greater version of itself. I've done a little bit of blacksmithing as karma and chance would happen. It was a great, good karma and a lot of fun to work briefly with Rick Morehouse at Ananda Village, who's a blacksmith. And I'll tell you, even when you heat up a piece of steel to almost white-hot heat and you pull it out of the furnace, it doesn't just conform to your will, you have to smack it with a hammer. And so too is our inner spine. All the vrittis, even when we heat them up with the love of devotion, with the presence of God, it's not, perhaps they will conform more easily than they had before, but still, when a piece of steel comes out of the fire, the next thing it goes to is the anvil. And then, we talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. That's nothing compared to being on the anvil of a blacksmith, because then you're stuck between steel and steel. And the blacksmith delivers intentional, powerful blows with his hammer to move the steel into a better and more pure expression of itself. But it takes some impact. I was really impressed. There was a time my friend Christian and I were working on a piece together, and I literally had a two-handed sledgehammer, and he would hit once with his one-handed hammer, and I would hit it as hard as I could with the sledgehammer, because it took a lot of power to move the steel to conform to our will. And so in our lives, it takes a blow sometimes from our life circumstances to reshape the steel of our inner spine. So when these things come, rather than turning away from them, rather than dispersing the heat that is generated by the tapasya of our endurance, that'll only make it more challenging for Divine Mother to rework our spines. When you're smithing a sword, when you're working with steel, a lot of it has to do with timing. That once the steel is hot, you have only a very short window of time to work with it until you have to put it back in the furnace and heat it up again. And so when in your life you feel that you are getting heated up by the fire of your tapasya, by the fire of your love for God, by the fire of trials in your life, if you run away from that, that'd be like taking the steel out of the furnace and immediately quenching it. You lose all the opportunity to be reshaped. But if you take that fire, you take that heat, and you offer yourself at the altar of the anvil of God and say, Master, rework me. I am pliable now. And I do not turn away from the blows of your hammer, nor from the cold wall of your anvil, but I embrace it, ready to be reshaped and reformed according to your will. Then in those moments, the Guru God can rework the very essence of who you are with his concentrated and perfectly placed blows of his hammer, of his will, reshaping our lives. Forge in me, from the tempered steel of mental balance, sharp swords of self-control and firm tenacity. With the weapon of inner equilibrium, teach me to fight every enemy of distraction. Because the net result of this prayer, really putting ourselves in the hands of the divine artisan, is that we perhaps will have to endure discomfort for a while, but the product is we will come out shining and strong. And we'll find that the enemies of dark, or the enemies of light, those dark forces within us, flee before us, because we have been transformed by the grace of the Guru, by the grace of God, into a weapon of inner equilibrium. So I will encourage you, if you feel inspired, to take this prayer this week, because I think it's clear that the world is undergoing a little bit of a furnace of trials right now. But what if that furnace of trials is actually a deep blessing, a tremendous spiritual opportunity? And it is a very large group karma that our collective world is going through right now. And no one is going to escape it completely unscathed. And so my invitation to all of us, to myself, to everyone, is to accept the furnace of this trial that we're all collectively going through as an opportunity to become just a little bit more malleable to the hands of God and to the will of your Guru in your life to reshape you, to form you into what he wants you to be. Because that's the opportunity that's in front of us. And if we shy away from it, we'll miss this incredible spiritual opportunity. But if we embrace it wholeheartedly, we might just discover that at the end of it, we emerge as a hero, that we emerge as a more pure and perfect expression of ourselves that we never knew was in there, that was just waiting to be expressed. I'll read this prayer one more time to close. In the furnace of trials, the ore of my life is being purified. The fire of experience melts away all my delusions' dross. O divine artisan, burn away all my impurities. Bring out in me the steel of endurance and hone it to a fine edge by deep calmness. Forge in me from the tempered steel of mental balance sharp swords of self-control and firm tenacity. With the weapon of inner equilibrium, teach me to fight every enemy of distraction. God bless you, friends.